Please enjoy and welcome Luke Leung.
Shall I start?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So the learning objectives here, it will be kind of information packed today. So hopefully it will worth the hour you're participating. So thank you for the invitation. So we are still in the middle of it, isn't it? Kind of the pandemic. So this is 2019 United Nations World Health Organization mentioned the top 10 things that can derail human society in the future. Pandemic, number 3. So what is worse than pandemic? Chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases, and number 1, climate change. So those are the top 3 things that's going to impact on our health that can potentially derail humanity in the future. On top of those 3 things, population. We are anticipating 2.0 billion people increase in the next 30 years. So by 2050, humanity will increase 25% more population. I mean, you really need to chew on that. A quarter more people, a quarter more portion of people on Earth. And not only that, by 2050, not like 2019, where people over 65 is only 9%, it's gonna be 16%, almost double the global population above 65 years old. Worse for America and Europe, it's gonna be 1 out of 4 people or persons is going to be above 65. So if you think pandemic hit us hard today in America and the world, because there's so many people in the nursing home, the senior living, and they end up in hospital, think 30 years later, when 25% of North America people above 65. Problem is when you're above 65, it just balloon the amount of healthcare costs here. So you can see on about once you're above 65, it just mushroom out the amount of illness you have, no matter male or female. Females on the right, male on the left. And the different shades of blue are chronic diseases, which is the second health impact that can derail humanity. So let's kind of march through these 3 elements for the rest of the hours to understand how we can do better. Climate change. We're going to have to move towards whole life carbon. We kind of know that because by 2060, there will be 2.5 trillion more square feet of building because of the 2 billion more population. That is the entire building stock of the world. We need to double that. So there's a lot of area we're going to put in. And because of that, we have to maintain 2040, 1.5 degrees C per latest United Nations IPCC report to maintain the climate change doesn't get worse, 1.5 degrees C by 2040. And it's because of that amount of people, the amount of building, the carbon budget for that 1.5 degrees C is actually only 340 gigatons of CO2, not a lot. And of course, by now you've probably seen it like 1,000 times that buildings account for almost 40% of the carbon emission. Significant of them is in operation, about 11% in embodied. We know much better to do operational carbon. Now, by the way, this is the framework of EN 15978. If you are not familiar with it, you probably should, because there are a lot of organizations out there already using this sort of framework. And the operational carbon is really at B6 and B7 at the bottom part. What you can see here, B6 and B7 categories. We're going to see a lot more city move forward, like city of Boston. They have actually not energy, but carbon emission standard for different types of building from now till 2050, which will be net zero. So I think we're going to see more of that as you know, City of Chicago task force on building decarbonization, we actually have discussed information like that of how to achieve a net zero future. And because this is like a map of the cities around US that will be going more towards performance-based standard on either carbon or energy. So this is rapidly coming across the entire US and the world. But I think the operational carbon piece we have may be more familiar with it. It's going to be more about embodied carbon. Now, if you look at the total life cycle carbon here, we know operation carbon is B6 and B7 at the bottom. This is embodied carbon, the category A, B, C, D. And you probably heard a lot of discussion about A1 to A3, which is cradle to the gate of the factory building. There are many specifications that people start using that start asking for that information or specify the amount of carbon you can embody in those equipment, less in MEP, more so in structure, in architecture. So those are the product A to 3, the upfront carbon category. And then A4 to A5, the transportation carbon to the site. That is a smaller portion, but people start also think about that. But more importantly is the in-use carbon. Now, why is the in-use carbon important? Because in this embodied carbon, it talks about the leakage of refrigerant, which has become a lot more attention to that because they're moving in several states. They're moving from GWP of 750 or below. So some states you cannot even use R410A or R134A. You have to use R32 or R513A, lower than GWP of 750. Once you go over a certain amount of volume in the building. So that limits potentially what type of HVAC equipment you can use, because not all refrigerant can be used in all kinds of HVAC equipment. In fact, as we go forward in time for any specific HVAC equipment, right now, much of it is the blue, the operational energy. But for those who use refrigerant in the future, once you get rid of the operational energy, the refrigerant leakage can be the next most significant carbon piece inside an equipment, and then the embodied carbon, which is gray in the picture here. Finally, is the end of life, how much of that you can recycle. So that makes up of the embodied carbon. Now, SIPC people, as you know, UK already addressed this piece of embodied carbon in MEP. There's standard in MEP embodied carbon, including refrigeration leakage as part of the embodied carbon. ASHRAE is right now thinking of using similar standard, basically use TM65, but adopt it and make it a North America version so that the manufacturers can have a simple and less expensive way to provide embodied carbon information. And for the design people, you have seen AIA 2030, SE 2050. You probably might have heard MEP 2040, which will actually go to operational net zero by 2030 and embodied carbon net zero by 2040. Those are the firms that sign it on the top and the supporters in the below. So if your firms are interested in it, please contact me, or you can go to the website from Carbon Leadership Forum to sign on to MEP 2040. Or if you're a supporter, feel free to do that or contact me. So that's life cycle carbon. So we quickly touch on carbon. So we're going to move into the next module. It's about kind of the pandemic. What is in the air? So when we look at pandemic, we see a whole bunch of things. We see not only the pandemic, but also it reflects the equity issue of much more hospitalization and death if you are, the minorities, right? Almost 4 times hospitalization or death. Death is about 2.5 times more almost if you are American Indians and other non-Hispanic, etc. minorities. And the other is not just race is an issue, but also if you are senior living or school, you tend to have more outbreaks, especially senior living, which we'll touch on more later. A lot of outbreaks in there. So moving forward, in order to have a healthier world, we got to start looking at the PM 2.5. And then those are the visibles, those are the non-visible elements. But the good things here is no matter it's kind of fire, pollen, bacteria, viruses, combustion material, MERV-13 filter can take care of a lot of those, except if it's a gas, right? You have to use carbon filter. So moving forward, ASHRAE and many organizations around the world is now thinking of somehow use MERV-13 or equivalent to provide the necessary indoor air quality. So one thing we can do is maybe we will spend more time outside, because when you are outside, your chance of breathing in any contaminants is about 1,000 times less compared to indoor. So this is north, sorry, 330 North Green. They're actually this space that can open to outside to create this half climate space. ASHRAE is right now drafting an emerging issue brief on dynamic thermal environment. How do you design for this sort of half climate space? What are the issues to think about? Because when you open your window, or if you provide circulated indoor air, if you have free air changes, you can eliminate 95% of the contaminant inside the space. So provide clean air. Now, clean air doesn't have to come from outside, but it could be from the outside or from the inside. It can eliminate 95% of the contaminants. But what about the times you cannot spend outside? You cannot spend in locations that are open to the outside. So the indoor environment is addressed in the pandemic by the core recommendations. Some of you are familiar with it. We quickly go over that. The first is to provide minimal outdoor air. You do not need to provide more outdoor, you are not required to provide more outdoor air than minimum for pandemic purpose. So one of the reasons is because of this. Because if you have MERV-13, you turn the corner, 100% outside air only can eliminate just a little bit more risk, but you are paying a lot more if you are in Chicago, as you can see on the screen. So MERV-13 is a very good place to be. And the other thing to think about is a combination of MERV-13 filter or air cleaner or UV light. So the idea is MERV-13 filter at the AHU, portable air cleaners, or UV light. These three elements basically combine together to provide this MERV-13 or better level of performance. Now, MERV-13 filter, a lot of people say, oh, it's going to cost you a lot more to run it, but you probably saw the ASHRAE journal last year in about July or August. It actually talked about, compared to MERV-5, MERV-13 does not necessarily increase the amount of pressure drop. Now, but you got to be careful, because if it's a 1-inch MERV-13 filter, oftentimes it's pre-charged with electricity. So it may be more efficient initially. As times go by, then the charge kind of drop, and then the efficiency will drop too. So the 1-inch MERV-13 filter, you just have to be mindful of that. Well, who's doing that? If you work with GSA P100 latest edition, already recommend MERV-13 filter in all the AHUs, different types of MERV-13 filter. It will be more like a back filter for AHU, but more like a 1-inch filter for fan coil, and you will have to add filter to fan coil, fan power boxes. All the recirculation element need to have MERV-13 filter. And it's also provision for the area like California, which will see wildfire. Now, when you mix MERV-13, portable air cleaner, and UV light together, you can potentially have higher level of protection than just basic MERV-13, right? So depending on what your space requirement is, you can potentially add this device in different configuration to improve your protection. You probably heard of the equivalent outdoor air approach, which is allow you to add, quote unquote, equivalent outdoor air together. So if you have outdoor air, you have MERV7, you have UVC light, you have these three elements, you can actually add them together. In this case, it forms about 6.84 of equivalent outdoor air. So this approach is on the ASHRAE website. You can download it and use it. Another concern is we saw during COVID time, it is that a VRF system, the cassette with no filter, right? So when you start recycling the air with no filter, that's what happened in a Guangzhou restaurant. It ended up a lot of people getting infected beyond the distance of 2 meters, right? This is the famous case. So moving forward, what we think will be important is if you're going to have sort of VRF cassette inside a space with no filter, you may want to start thinking about provision of certain air cleaners in the space that achieve that MERV 13 rating when it's required during pandemic time. So how do we design our buildings, especially for the senior citizen who saw huge amount of outbreaks in their senior living, as some of these buildings has VRF cassette. So we got to start planning for how do we achieve that MERV 13 or above filtration holistically. Now, what if you have Omicron or the other viruses that are much more infectious than the current one? So this is what happened. If a typical 2 air change winter, this is like say a VAV environment in the winter time, let's say minimum outside air, you have only about 2 air changes, right? This is the old virus. The risk is only 1.4%, not so bad. It jumps to 7% if you are the Omicron virus, which is about, let's say 4 to 5 times more infectious than the old virus. Now, this VAV system is in the winter. In the summertime, it's not bad, right? The risk is significantly lower because once you get to 5 to 6 air changes, if you are the old virus, you are about 0.5%. Maybe the Omicron virus is about 1.2%. The issue here is if you have DOS, if you have DOS, have only 1 air change, for example, radiant ceiling, right? Your risk from the old virus is about 1.2, but it jumped to 12% if you have the Omicron. So in this sort of dedicated outdoor air space with radiant ceiling, perform great on energy, but during these times with certain type of virus, as you know, like the Omicron, you really need to think about providing that MERV 13 filter into the space to minimize the risk, or maybe beyond, depending on the space type. Okay, so pandemic. Moving forward to actually, maybe before we move forward. So the key there is provide MERV 13 filter or equivalent or more, depending on the risk of the space, right? So chronic diseases, what's happening to human race? So there are this physiology in the human body. There are 10 different systems. Now, just now we touch on greatly during the pandemic discussion about the respiratory system. So we'll focus a little bit on the nervous system of how biophilic design, seeing green, able to have nature around you. When you see that, it kind of calms you down and, you know, calms your nervous system down. So like we're seeing a little bit more of this sort of more natural design building. This one we did in Shenzhen, China, headquarters for BEMP. But there's also muscular system, not just nervous system, muscular system as in we need to walk 7,000 steps a day. We see design towards more expressing of the stairwell and use of the stairwell in building. And then the hormone system, the address of the circadian cycle, because actually there's more blood flow to your brain when you're sleeping than when you are awake. So oftentimes your best idea come up when you just wake up from your sleep, because there's actually plenty of blood just flow to your brain when you're sleeping. So to address this circadian rhythm, there are buildings that are, hold on one second. So we start addressing the lighting of the building in terms of not use the white and blue light in the nighttime, etc., etc. And it's also our skin, as in a lot of Americans and actually a lot of humans in general are lacking of vitamin D, which you can get a dose of that when you're outdoor. And it's an equity issue too, because oftentimes the service industry, like the African American, Hispanic, they actually have higher vitamin D deficient because they spend more time as service industry indoor. So this building, 330 North Green, we actually have this element on the south side, like a porch, to allow people to go outdoor during their lunch hour to get a dose of sunlight. Also impact our skin is microbials. Studying the rural area and the urban area, the New York University researchers find out the microbial makeup of the urban environment is very different than the rural environment. And they come to the conclusion that part of the reason why there's so many chronic diseases in this generation is because we disturb the microbial biome in our built environment. Now, you've probably been seeing some address of this probiotic air, or your probiotic food, right? We need more research on this stuff, though they hold some promise, but there's a lot more research need to be done to understand what is that probiotic air that will be healthy for everybody. But in the meantime, a dose of natural ventilation may be also helpful to bring in this case here, we actually plant trees outside the building to have a little bit of that diverse microbe to bring inside the building. So finally, we address three things already. Is the climate change, pandemic, and also the the chronic diseases, right? The change in human body. Finally, I want to add a little bit of that Midwest twist here. When we look at the world 8,000 years BC, it looks like this. This is the world today. It's not the urban area, it's the farming area that impact the green area. We took down a lot of the forest to create this farming area. And if you, we are from Illinois, a lot of us are, so we know what that means. Now, when that happened, actually the world as a whole, this is a paper done by MIT, is that it decreased the amount of biogenic secondary organic aerosol. Basically, a lot of this microbial from plants, they decrease. Now remember that diversity of microbial is important, right? We actually decrease that diversity. What increases is the nitrogen oxide from the soil released into the atmosphere, and the ozone increase. So the air we breathe compared to pre-industrial revolution, probably not as healthy. And also the soil we live in, since we are in Midwest, there's huge amount of this runoff to the Gulf of Mexico to form the dead zone. What is the dead zone is if you can take one of that state in US and you can put it there, it's significantly larger than that. It's the nitrogen and phosphate runoff in the Midwest area or the farming and create this dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And when you see it from the satellite, this is what you will see from the satellite, the amount of nutrients that bring into the Gulf of Mexico and actually destroying a lot of the marine life in that area until the next year, the climate change, and it will kind of change that environment, then bring back the marine life, and it happened all over again every year as a cycle. That environment, that element flow into the Gulf of Mexico, also flow into our tummy. Sorry about that, I know it's lunchtime, but it's a little different than pre-industrial revolution. Pre-industrial revolution, that was a cycle. So what goes into our tummy tend to be a more diverse microbe. Today, with the pesticide, with the different way we treat our waste, and the post-industrial treatment of food, etc., we broke down that kind of microbial cycle. So it's no surprise today that inside our guts, the microbe is completely different than the pre-industrial people. Well, how do we know the pre-industrial people? How's their gut microbe look like? So what we did is actually we studied the Amish people to figure out how's the gut microbes are different. Now maybe the haircut also helped, but other than the haircut, the Amish people are significantly healthier than the typical Americans. Part of that is the gut microbe. How do we know that? Because the gut microbes is really just about, add all of that together, is about the size of a mango, but it also help to develop your immune system, digest your food, your brain development, and eliminate pathogen inside our body. So if the gut microbe change, you as a person also change. Just like what University of Oxford told us, it said the gut microbe actually link to your personality. So sometimes you think, oh, maybe the world is changing. Oftentimes it's maybe not the world, it's you, but the other times it's actually the world. So if you think the person next to you is acting a little bit strange, you may want to ask them, what did you eat yesterday? Because this research indicate your gut microbe can potentially develop a whole bunch of chronic diseases, from asthma to cardiovascular to type 2 diabetes. It has that impact on not just the food you eat, but how the gut microbes digest the food you eat. So how do we change that? This is a scenery that we are very familiar with. If you are like me, travel to all over the place in Illinois, Iowa, Michigan for your son's baseball game, you drive through all these cornfields, and oftentimes there are no cover crops, so they are not, the nutrient get released to the atmosphere as nitrogen oxide and also go into the river, Mississippi River, and goes down to the Gulf of Mexico. So what we need is kind of have cover crops and provide a more renewable farming in the future to bring not just a healthier environment, but also healthier human beings. So oftentimes we said, as we think about bio-based material, right? We're going to say, oh, let's try to use whole life carbon. We want to lower the whole life carbon. Let's use bio-based material. Well, unless the bio-based material comes from the regenerative farms, potentially they can actually do more damage and release more carbon than just other materials. So we have to be really careful when we start specifying bio-based material, especially since we are from Midwest. So if we can specify and start thinking about regenerative farms, we can potentially change the runoff to the Gulf of Mexico to no runoff, make the environment healthier and people healthier. So what did we cover today quickly in less than 40 minutes is, first, we look at the 3 elements that's going to derail human in terms of health, and we address them, starting from climate change, and then we look at post-pandemic building, what needs to be done, and then we look at chronic diseases, and finally, we look at how, as people who live in Midwest, we can potentially address an ecosystem issue that can help not only create a healthier environment, but create healthier human beings in Midwest. With that, I'm going to stop and we can open to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. For those who have questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. In terms of the PDHs, I will look into that question for you real quick. I don't know the immediate answer. Does anyone else have any questions we'd like to ask? Please feel free to pop those in the Q&A or in the chat. Mm. There we go. So we've got PDHs will get emailed out to attendees after the last spring conference webinar, which is this Thursday. Here's a question from Luis Lara. If a DOAS can have a higher contamination risk due to low ACH, how should we address the fact that they can be more energy efficient? What is the balance we should strive for?
Yeah, great question. As you probably figure out already, there is a I'm not going to go back to the chart, but as you can see, if the virus is not very infectious, the risk between a DOAS and another system with high air changes is actually not as bad relatively. The problem comes when the virus is really infectious, then the risk is significantly higher because it's a exponential curve, right? It's the other way, but it kind of like this. You are on the tail end of the exponential curve. So when that time comes, one of the things you can do is really to maybe provide more portable air cleaner, because it's really no easy way to create this recirculation air to rapidly clean it up unless you have portable air cleaners. And so as the world, like if you look at what happened after pandemic, right? UK already come out and said, in all their building, they want the ability to make the provision, not that you have to do it every day, make the provision of even HEPA filter in their buildings. We don't believe it's necessary to go to HEPA filter because of many good reasons. But if how do we maintain at least that MERV 13 minimal or better performance? Maybe portable air cleaner is one of the way to do that. Now, during design, then you have to figure out like what's the clean air delivery rate of the air cleaner, and how do you position this air cleaner so that room can be optimized if it's a dedicated outdoor air system. And there are times, give it as wildfire, give it as pandemic, that this sort of natural things or man-made things that request a good air cleaning, then you may need to do that. And also in certain system types, for example, VRF, cassettes, then you need to start thinking about how do we minimize the amount of portable air cleaners we need, because the system cannot deliver that MERV 13 or equivalent air quality. That's definitely something we need to think about, especially actually some of you already know that ASHRAE right now is thinking about how do we address holistically in the future our buildings can have the capacity, not that they have to do it every day, to do MERV 13 or above.
Do you agree that MERV 8 followed by MERV 11 is equal to MERV 13?
You can use, so off the top of my head, I don't know the answer. I think we need to go to that equivalent outdoor air approach to look at, if you add the two together, will they be equivalent to MERV 13? But chances are you might have slightly higher pressure drop right off the bat. And because the way it works, as you know already, probably, that it's going to be, let's say if your MERV 8 is 50% of, certain range of elements, say, whatever microns range of elements you can filter, and then MERV 11, say 70%. So the total will be first 50%. So you have 50% left, and then 70% of that 50% will be filter. So that's how it works. So I don't off the top of my head, I don't know the answer, but you can download the equivalent outdoor air approach to add that two together to see if it works that way. Now that's very specific to the COVID-19 virus spectrum. So you have to be mindful of that too.
So we got another question from Amy. What are companies, buildings currently doing to reduce their carbon footprint, carbon offset credits, etc.? And how do you think that will change over time as legislation increases requirements and reducing carbon becomes more mainstream?
So I think this applies to many of us who work in Chicago, because the city of Chicago, as you know, is considering that as a top-down policy to get to a net zero future for Chicago and around the world. And some of you already know the President Biden's December 8th, the executive order issued on that day asked for a completely clean grid in US by 2035, and then all the federal buildings net zero by 2045. So this is coming. So that's top down. We know that that's coming. So what we're going to do, number one is get the embodied, okay, study the whole life carbon, right? Like the chart we saw today. Today, we focus a lot on operational carbon, but the embodied carbon piece, especially MEP, very, very, very small amount of information we have on embodied carbon, but that's changing. Why is it changing? So there are, as you know, some of this EC3 and etc. start using and have more information on MEP embodied carbon. ASHRAE, as we mentioned, is going to start using TM65, or at least considering using TM65 to provide embodied carbon, MEP embodied carbon information. And also, we are, ASHRAE again, is developing a refrigerant whole life carbon calculation sheet in the task force on building decarbonization. So we're going to publish that soon, so you can actually calculate how much carbon emission, both on embodied and that's both, not both embodied and operation carbon. Refrigerant is actually embodied carbon in life cycle analysis, but it's scope 1 emission fugitive when it comes to an organization. So we'll be having those tools get ready for whole life carbon calculation. So switching to just energy modeling to whole life carbon modeling is going to be the thing in the future. There will be many tools from ASHRAE. You can start get them to do that.
Thanks for that thoughtful response, Luke. And it looks like we are good on questions, unless anyone has anything burning that they want to ask. Otherwise, we can give you a 15-minute break before your next meeting for lunch or whatever that may be. But thank you so much for joining our webinar today. Like I said, we have an additional webinar, our last one on Thursday at noon, regarding commissioning. I wanted to also bump our calendar of events for the Illinois ASHRAE chapter. In addition to our webinar, we have a membership meeting next month in April on the 12th. Like I said, it will be at Pazos in downtown with our ASHRAE presidents. So be sure to sign up. And thank you so much again, Luke, for being our lecturer today and providing us with this information.
Yeah, happy to be here. Let's work together to create a healthier Chicago and Illinois, and create a low carbon or net zero Chicago and Illinois. That would be wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all.